Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this latest installment of our Law, Technology, and Warfare Research Cells webinar series. I am Major Danny Bollier, and today we have with us Mr. Grant Calhoun, the Director of Industry Research Contracting at Colorado State University, to talk about public-private partnerships and his work with high-powered lasers and nuclear fusion at Colorado State University. Before we begin with the real content of today's webinar, I would like to note that all speakers on the LitWork webinar series present in their personal capacities, and their comments and views do not necessarily represent the views of any governmental entity. Further, the appearance in our programming of individuals or references to companies, products, or services does not imply or constitute any governmental endorsement. With that, I would like to introduce our speaker today. Mr. Grant Calhoun is the Director of Industry Research Contracting at CSU. He consults on private industry as well as federal research administration, including projects for DoD, DARPA, DOE, and ARPA-E. Prior to law school, he worked in geospatial intelligence for CACI. And after graduating from the Denver Stern College of Law, he created the Export Control Office at CSU before joining the General Counsel's office. Finally, for the audience that is joined us today, feel free to ask any questions you might have throughout the webinar in the chat. Either maybe we'll interject them as we go or take them at the end. But with that, I am pleased to turn it over to Mr. Calhoun to share his thoughts with us and his experiences. Sir, the webinar is yours.
Thank you, Danny. Good morning and good afternoon to others joining today. Thanks for the opportunity to speak on this today, and I'm excited to hear what questions the audience has about any of the steps in this process. A little bit about me. I appreciate the kind introduction. I did study political geography and GIS as an undergrad and did some work for CACI CACI on defense mapping and some other projects for the Navy and NGIA. And actually, some of the other commercial mapping we did included work for companies where their maps, public-facing maps, needed place name and boundary locations based on which country they were accessed from, which is very pertinent to some changes in the U.S. today. In law school, I enjoyed contracts and international law, administrative law, and then out of law school, coming to work for CSU. As many of you know, as general counsel and others, it's fascinating to see the inside of a big organization. And a university has all the challenges of a major company, the student body and privacy, research, real estate, intellectual property. And so it's a fascinating process to see behind the curtain at an organization like that. CSU itself is a major land-grant university and does about $575 million of research this last year, which has been growing a lot over the last decade or so. About 500 million of that is federal research, which is making things there's a lot of uncertainty right now in that area. I help manage a portfolio at the moment of about $25 million of private industry research. But in my other capacity, I've consulted with our sponsored research group on all different kinds of awards, including those defense awards and energy awards. CSU is known mostly for our veterinary science program. We have one of the top schools in the country in that area, agricultural sciences. We were Colorado A&M, just like Texas A&M or any other school before they switched to Colorado State. But we do have a couple other specialized areas, one of which is high-powered lasers. Sorry, I'm not advancing my slides. CSU has had a special lab that's grown out of the last 20 years or so called the Advanced Beam Lab. And that has provided over $100 million in sponsored research and was really, created as part of support from an NSF Engineering Research Center grant. So back in 2003. Those are difficult to get, and they tend to go up to maybe 10 years of funding. And so through that funding, we were able to take kind of an empty lab almost and slowly build up the power and repetition rate and other characteristics of a laser system that we use right now called ALIF. We produced a lot of graduates into the tech industry and in chips and lithography and other particularly defense companies who need this type of technology. as in any academic environment, key faculty and end up being the cornerstone for allowing you to do bigger projects, attracting the right graduate students and industry partners. We like to think that we are the matchmakers between industry and our research expertise, but in reality, it's really those key researchers and people in the field that people look to, and they already have those connections, and we really help foster those most of the time. Uh, High energy lasers, we're talking about fusion energy here today, nuclear fusion, and that is certainly an application of high energy lasers. But most of the work we've done at CSU to this point has been fundamental science in those plasma areas, as well as other work in materials characterization, medicine opportunities for hadron therapy and lots of defense applications. So a lot of our sponsored work has been from the National Science Foundation initially, and then quite a bit of DoD and Department of Energy funding over the last 10 or 15 years. Some examples of the kind of work you can do in this area. Tomography is one of the more interesting ones from an imaging point of view. So from a very high-powered laser with a very quick repetition rate, so it's firing very quickly, you can send particles that are so small so quickly that you can penetrate solid objects without really damaging the object. So it's like a less damaging kind of X-ray. So it allows you to look inside objects and see what's happening inside without having to tear them apart. This is an example. I can't get the video to play inside the presentation, but this is an example of a tomograph of a molecular pump. So this pump is placed inside the target chamber of the laser facility. The laser comes in, it's vacuum sealed, and then this is turning inside. So the pump is actually moving. And you can take these images quickly enough that then you can create essentially a video of in real time of what's happening inside the turbine. So a lot of the funding for the laser lab at CSU in the last 10 years in particular has been from the Department of Energy through the LaserNet US network. LaserNet was created in 2018 in response to kind of the assessment and understanding in the US government that the US was falling behind in terms of the availability and how cutting edge our high-powered laser facilities were. And even though the US was a leader in establishing most of this technology, over the last 50 years, we had not really invested enough to keep up with Europe and China. And so what's created is a network of about 11 research institutions at universities that are or national labs that are funded to do very high-end, high-energy laser work, and each one has a kind of a different special capability. So on the map there, you can see that they're mostly on the coast, but Nebraska, Lincoln, and CSU also have nodes. CSU tends to be one of the cornerstones of the network. And the way it works is research groups apply to the Fusion Energy Sciences Department in the DOE with their project, the idea for it. The DOE selects the projects they think are most important or most promising, and then provide funding to the universities in LaserNet to then allow those research groups to come and conduct their experiments at those facilities. Along with capabilities, it's also designed to increase the workforce opportunities and really grow the next generation of some of these laser science participants, because the kind of the first wave, the old guard, is about to age out and retire. And so that was another motivation to create the LaserNet US program. Just for a little context, and I know no one can read this, but this is a chart of the organization of the Department of Energy, and down at the bottom in the green box is the location of the Office of Science, which includes Fusion Energy Sciences. And that's been the primary federal partner for CSU in this area and in the Atlas project that's coming up in our discussion. Quickly about fusion energy, because when I started this, I was certainly not a scientist that knew much about this, and probably had to start from the beginning with what is a laser to make sure I understood. And so quickly to understand fusion energy and the motivations of our commercial partner, along with the Department of Energy, a quick explanation. We've heard some about fusion energy, and there are different ways to try and achieve it. And science has been said the concept of fusion for 50 years and not been able to really crack the code on how to do it. Conceptually, it's the idea of having a reaction, whether it's magnetic, whether it's laser driven, that takes less energy in than it puts out. So the whole idea being that by taking particles and putting them together, you're using the energy that is distributed by the parts of those particles that are not included in the final product, shoot off as energy, and making sure that that energy is greater than the energy that went into the reaction, at greater in a proportional way that makes it feasible to create a power source from that. Fusion is very different than fission, which we obviously have worked on for some time, in which you're creating nuclear waste and all these things by tearing apart those particles. So fusion has many advantages to fission in the sense that it's clean energy, it's renewable in the sense that it's unlimited, and once you have a system up and running, it's essentially producing energy to whatever degree you need it to, as long as you can scale it up. People have been working on this for a long time, and in December of 22, out in California at NIF, they finally had the first reaction to really have an excess of energy come out of it that they could measure effectively and really confirm. The NIF National Ignition Facility at Lawrence Livermore is made up of 192 lasers, huge, it's the size of a football field, all these tubes coming together to focus on one spot. So they're firing all those lasers at the same time to hit one tiny target and then see if they can create more energy than it took to put in. One difference in CSU's approach, and the reason that our private partner picked CSU to work with, is the nature of our lasers in particular. So we have very high-powered lasers, but they have a very quick repetition rate. So the achievements at NIF included, a huge facility with a lot of lasers that they have longer beam time. So it's all relative to being extremely quick, but a much longer beam. The beam takes longer to hit the target and be generated through the system and from the initial light, and they can't shoot very quickly. They have to set everything up and make their shot and get the data and come back and do it again. Usually not more than one or two shots a day. So the difference with what CSU and our partner is working on is how quickly you can shoot the laser again. So if you're really going to have sustainable, scalable fusion energy, you need to have shots going almost constantly and have them not have the need for calibration, the need to really wait and see what data came out of that and what, if anything, needs to be adjusted. And so that is making CSU's approach from a technological point of view attractive to companies trying to create laser-driven fusion energy. I apologize, it's a little hard to read. This is an announcement on the website of Marvel Fusion, which is a German company that we're partnering with as part of our kind of public-private project. We announced in August of 2023 that we would be building a facility together here on the CSU campus with contributions from CSU, Marvel itself, and support from the Department of Energy at roughly $150 million, at least initially. Just for context here, in October, we worked together to select the architect for the project. And last spring, we got the contractor on board, began design process, and finished the design just about at this point. And we went ahead and broke ground in October. at a ceremony here at CSU. And the timeline, the goal for operation is to have the facility open the middle of 26 and then really have the commissioning and the operations up and running later that year in the fall. This is a little bit kind of a vision of the building. There's the Undersecretary of Energy, Ms. Granholm, who came out for the groundbreaking. And so this is the facility we'll be building together. And please stop me with any questions. I'm kind of zipping through this. The details of this partnership. Each of public higher education, private industry, and the federal government have different needs and different assets to offer a project like this. On one hand, CSU is continuing to build our capacity and cutting edge technology in laser research. And we're coming at this from a known science point of view. So we have experts in a particular field who are at the leading edge, and we know the type of science we're trying to do and where we think it'll go, where we typically have funding for it. What's hard in a public education environment is that we don't have a lot of money. And if we actually build a facility, we tend to build a good facility that's going to last because that's in our interest. And we don't have a lot of funding to put things in the facility. So we rely particularly on the federal government project by project to help build up the internal capabilities of our facilities and our research opportunities. From private industry's point of view, and we'll talk a little bit about Marvel Fusion, our partner, and where they are on the trajectory of a fusion startup company. They're in an early stage. They've had a couple funding rounds through their B series round and have raised almost $200 million. But they're in a situation where they have investors, they have a plan, and they're on a short timeline because they need to hit these milestones in order to keep investor money coming, to get to the next stage, and to prove that they're progressing in a way that also gets them public funding, because there's a lot of public incentive to have companies like this succeed. Particularly in talking broadly, not getting into Marvel's details that aren't to be shared, the concept of a laser-driven startup like this, and there are several, is the idea of going from having a set of physics that you believe will result in a net positive outcome, working through those physics, getting to a laboratory proof of concept stage where you have your initial equipment, you have it set up, you can actually create the reactions you need. Maybe it's not at the level you need it, maybe the equipment itself is not your final design, but it's putting together your proof of concept that at least the reaction itself can be successful. The next stage after that is really a break-even facility. And so that's where you're actually building a building that has the technical specs that you need. You've now scaled up to, if you initially had one laser or two lasers, now you're going to 20 or 50 or something scalable. It's widely considered that these facilities would not be enough to generate a notable amount of power to then hook up to the grid and be useful yet, but it's showing that you can network your equipment and lasers in these ways. And at that point, you're really starting to work with typical energy companies because they have the expertise to have that infrastructure at scale to move energy, to connect it to the grid. And then after that, then you would really have an industrial scale power plant would be the next step. And all of these are heavy investments of capital to get to that point. And so we'll come back to that and where Marvel is in that stage. And the U.S. Department of Energy, the federal government in general, public entities have the funding, obviously, but which we always say internally, you can't count on this coming. And now we're in an environment where we're seeing that come to light, possibly. But generally speaking, that's the most solid source of support for the kind of research we do and the kind of research and technology that would support um, the steps to be made by someone like Marvel Fusion. And they're basically in it for the human good, or at least for the needs of the federal government to further its goals, right? And bring the science forward no matter what the application is. So quickly, Marvel Fusion is based in Munich, and they've raised money. They've been growing very rapidly, and have a lot of funding, not just VC funding, but also public funding from the German government and the EU. And they found themselves in a situation where they actually, and this I think I found humorous, and others, they had so much trouble with the bureaucracy in Germany and the EU that they thought it was easier to come to the US and work with us. And I consider us to be full of bureaucracy and slow. So we find that funny, but apparently that was the best use, and brought them out to CSU. The agreement itself, just an overview, and then we'll talk about some more specifics, probably verbally, is that CSU agrees to build a new facility. It will have the technical specifications that CSU needs for its own laser, but also that Marvel Fusion needs for its test lasers. So as I mentioned, the stages that a startup laser-driven fusion company goes through, and they're rapid. Marvel Fusion is at the point where they need that proof of concept feasibility work. And so they are designing a 2-laser system that they'll network, and they need to prove that they can at least get the shots to work and that they're somewhat efficient before they move to that break-even prototype 20 to 50 laser kind of facility. But they don't want to have to build an entire facility for this step of the process. It's too early to build a much bigger facility that you could use use as your break-even facility. But you don't want to spend all the money to build a smaller facility to then not have it be useful for you. You can't exactly sell those on eBay. And so we figured out in talking to each other that CSU wants to build out this facility. We're at capacity in the current beam lab. We need to expand, but we don't have the money. And we haven't been able to make the value proposition in the face of everything else going on at the university, that for a small but highly regarded program, the university is going to sink all this money into a new facility when there are lots of needs across campus. Marvel didn't want to build their own facility, and they technically only need this space and the equipment in it for a short amount of time. They have just a few years, probably 5 to 10 years, to show that they're on the path and that they can make things work, that they've refined this technology, that they can make the lasers talk to each other in the coordination of the shots that they need to take. And at that point, they can move on. So our agreement was that Marvel would build their 2 lasers. They're using German governmental funding and some EU funding to build 2 identical lasers at very high-powered, high rep rate. So these are in the ballpark of 4 petawatt lasers and up to 10 shots per second. So 10 hertz rep rate. And those don't really exist anywhere. So this is the front edge of science. CSU, on its part, will build this facility at a cost of roughly $80 million. And in that facility, we will put our own laser supported by the Department of Energy, host Marvel Fusion and their lasers. Marvel Fusion will then convey title in the lasers to CSU. We will operate them, and they will have the opportunity to use a proportion of the laser time on their 2 lasers plus the CSU laser over the first 3 years, and then a smaller amount of time the years following that. And we figured out that that was the best combination of effort to satisfy everyone's interests. And we couldn't do it without the third leg of the Department of Energy. So they've been funding our operations through the LaserNet program. that makes access available to these research groups, but also provides a very steady funding stream that we relatively count on for multiple years to keep the lab open. We do lots of our own sponsored research that I alluded to from other agencies, but the baseline funding from LaserNet, something we can really count on. And the Department of Energy has a significant interest in this partnership working out. They want this capability in the US. They want to keep this new facility part of that LaserNet group and have a capability here that doesn't exist in the world right now anywhere else. Even as other countries and other places are pouring money into this topic, this is the fastest way to probably achieve that capability domestically. And while the DOE can't be a part of our agreements, all of our agreements, and in certain ways, and we certainly know now that incremental funding is not a guarantee, they had to play a role in making CSU and Marvel comfortable to make such an investment. I guess the one last thing to say about how this came to be is that through that LaserNet US program, Marvel Fusion came in as a user of the facility, and that's how the contact was initially made. So they came in about 2020 to run a campaign, which at the current CSU facility, it's one laser, one target chamber. And so you can only have one group working at a time. And it's usually a campaign of a week or 2 weeks or 4 weeks. They applied to the Department of Energy, were approved. Even as a foreign entity, they were approved as part of this program based on their goals, came to CSU. And in talking with their general counsel, simply under the auspices of space use agreement for them to come and use the facility and how we apportion the liability and the cost and where it went, the conversations began that led to what eventually is this partnership. And just some considerations about the contract and the structure, and I'll probably do all this verbally as part of the conversation leading to the agreement. There's several agreements. Some I can talk about, some I can't, but in general, looking at the needs of each party when we were trying to negotiate this to begin with, as I said, safety needs, or CSU needs the money for the investment of capabilities inside the facility, but it's also very important to CSU to have the diversity of use. So everyone benefited from the opportunity to have dual messaging, multiple messages to describe the goals and the context for this project. So on one hand, Marvel Fusion is talking about fusion energy and the green global opportunities for what they're trying to do, and it's important, and this is why it's important. And just as important to CSU are all the other applications of science and technology that I mentioned and more. And we know that there's a focus going forward on directed energy, other applications with things of this level. How mobile can you make this technology? And one of the projects referenced earlier is sending muons, which are a level of subatomic particle that I can't describe very well myself, but through solid objects other than what's in like a vacuum chamber in a laser lab. It's more of an imaging opportunity to look through underground tunnels or into terrain or through vehicles to have that same kind of imaging response. Has a lot of domestic and military applications. So in order for CSU to invest our substantial amount into this project, we had to feel comfortable in the diversity of uses. So if Marvel doesn't come through, and I mean, it's a big moonshot to get fusion energy to work, and a lot of people are working on it. If they can't make it work, CSU is still getting the capability and use out of the facility and the partnership that we bargained for in the beginning. We want Marvel to succeed by all means. And there were conversations about what commercialization would mean and opportunities for the university and Marvel based on a share of initial kind of in-kind investment, if you will, in this project. And so we very much want Marvel to succeed, but we feel much better about this kind of commitment because of the diversity of use of the facility, even if they don't succeed. Another couple aspects from the university and public entity point of view is in our facilities, we have different bonding rates for public use versus private bonding. And so if we are going to own the facility, or our research foundation is actually who owns the facility, I'll talk about that in just a second. We need to understand the mix of public and private use to see what kind of bonding proportions we need to go out to finance the building. So I think anytime we're going to have a public-private arrangement in a publicly owned building, we have to make sure we address that. We need to look at that and essentially not make a mistake or try and anticipate how much of that use will be quote unquote bad use that's not eligible for public financing at the public financing rate, bond rate. Marvel's needs in this case that are very different from CSU's, but it's also any industry partner that's in a similarly situated. They need to go fast. Universities don't go fast. We have committees with subcommittees and a pre-meeting for the subcommittee to get to the next step of just about any kind of process. And so the big push for us was, can we actually meet the timeline that Marvel needs from a publicity point of view? We really negotiate about when we made announcements because we didn't want to get ahead of our actual commitments in a public funding point of view and a governance and board of governors point of view. But on the other hand, private company raising money need something to show to keep the investment flowing and to show progress, and so that their story can line up with what's really happening, so they can prove that they're on track. And in the same way that CSU is practicing known science, in the sense that we know and we're making leaps and getting to the next stage in certain things, but we have a track that we see that we're on, that we feel good about what we're doing and how it will be funded. The private company is on the frontier. It's new science, right? They're trying to do things that haven't been done for a purpose that hasn't been achieved. And so their considerations there are, can we do this in a flexible way that's step by step enough that we can pivot if we need to, like a major pivot? And the university doesn't do very well in that environment. So as part of the contract structure between CSU and our private partner, we broke it up into a design and construction phase, and then we'll have a separate agreement dictating the operational phase and organization that now we're negotiating as design and construction's underway. Because there are just things we're not going to know, things that we'll learn as part of the design construction process, even the commissioning process, once the doors are open and the lights are on, and we get the actual laser equipment in and get them talking to each other and aligned in a way through a control system that actually makes everything work. We're going to find things that need to be changed. And so building in that flexibility from the company side is very important and is very scary for the university. And we found a balance there that seemed to give us enough outs to find a way forward. And from the DOE's point of view, I think is the entire national government's point of view, having these capabilities in the country, the also multiple messaging that on one hand, this is support for fusion energy, and there's a lot of ancillary support in different fusion-related federally sponsored projects right now, and that's all across the country in lots of different areas, but specifically in fusion energy, moving things forward with private industry. But at the same time, there's the military application of all this technology at the same time. And so maybe even in this current political environment, being able to point to different contexts and messaging is important on a federal level as well. And so I think part of the reason the project got off the ground was that we all had a different way to talk about it to the people that needed to make decisions. Um, the and drawing a company like Marvel to the U.S. So they've created a U.S. entity considering headquarters and other changes based on where they're really going to invest their infrastructure. If these kinds of facilities, or the break-even facility that they would move on, that they're preparing to source next, those are pretty sticky. You can't pack them up and take them with you. And so that drawing that kind of investment in high-end technology is, of course, another goal and interest of the DOE. There are plenty of concerns and challenges about the project and some of the considerations that we had to navigate from a security point of view in particular. I mean, we're bringing in international participants and partners into a facility that's clearly, ITAR and up from a controls point of view. We have to try and future-proof that kind of physical security. So on day one, we know what kind of badging and screening and the things we need, but not knowing exactly where the science will take us from a funding point of view or from a focus point of view, 5, 10 years more down the road, trying to build in, okay, we don't have the money for a SCIF. Do we want to provide space and infra space out need to or want to? Can we put in physical controls to make it a secure facility to some degree if we need or want to? So all of those things, and also bringing in all these other research groups from other places, not just domestically, and trying to understand how you actually build an operational schedule around that includes the proper screening and badging and making sure that you're not putting yourself in a position of either non-compliance or having a project break down or not move forward because there's some issue and you literally can't allow it to happen. You have the facility sit, it's not operating, it's not making money. And so trying to future-proof things that have been a complicated design and logistical challenge that we think we're handling, that we're continuing to work on. One other aspect of this arrangement I haven't mentioned so far is the presence and engagement of our research foundation. So the CSU Research Foundation, it's a 501c3 nonprofit that exists by state statute. So each public university in the state of Colorado has a nonprofit like this that they team up with. In our case, they do our tech transfer, real estate. They help with other financing things that we can't do on our own as a state entity. And from a funding and all these other reasons, we got them involved. CSU leased the land to the Research Foundation. They will own and build the building. CSU will lease it back from a use point of view. And then we have Marvel coming in as sort of a tenant. And so that is the way we could structure this and structure the financing to move forward. But their role in the triangle of CSU and Marvel and the Research Foundation is kind of the builder, owner, operator. It's not a national lab arrangement, although that would be, I mean, that's a possible vision for the future way down the road to have an operator run a facility like this. Their CSURF, the Research Foundation, is building the building and then will also operate and maintain. And so at some point, you go from operation and maintenance into really producing the science, and you have to figure out where the scientists stop and everything else begins. But that's a consideration when putting something like this with so many stakeholders together, that either that's a benefit and it's something you don't have to deal with if you're the entity like CSU, or it's less expensive than using state employees and state structures and resources for that. or if it's something you want under your control. For maybe the security considerations we talked about, for anything, make sure is that you need the security to know that you can control, you have good vision on, and even if it costs more, you can control the costs, or at least make decisions about costs because you know what they are. So there are lots of stakeholders in a situation like this. You have the key researchers who are the reason this is happening at all. You have their department, electrical and computer engineering. You have the college that the department is in, College of Engineering. You have the Office of the Vice President for Research, which is my office. You have the president's office and the leadership level who have to make these decisions. You have the Board of Governors that runs the entire university system, that is essentially vouching for the costs of the project, both CSU and the Research Foundation. You have the private company, and you have the Department of Energy. I think that's 8. So the fact that getting all the ducks in a row, it's not a very pretty process. It took a long time, but the fundamentals were there. And ultimately, the knowing that Marvel had their funding lined up, knowing that the Department of Energy was interested and is likely to continue funding the operational part of the facility, got the CSU Board of Governors and leadership to agree to our part of commitment for the facility itself. I know that's kind of a lot of information. I'd love to answer specific questions if you have them, or talk more about the different contract structures or anything else that people are curious about.
Well, thanks. Yeah, we do have a couple of questions that have rolled in. So in the meantime, if anyone else has some more, feel free to pop them in the chat, or you can type them into the Q&A. Yeah, so we had one question here. So as it comes to the project, how will the results and knowledge be shared with partners and others to use the outcome after this project?
I guess the resulting technology.
I think, yeah, so I think it's probably sort of an IP, who's going to own the IP, or how is it going to be shared? Yeah. If you can share.
Yeah, I can't speak to that exact outcome, except that that's a conversation and a part of the value proposition for everybody involved. But ultimately, by having that diverse set of opportunities for CSU, we're less tied to the fusion energy outcome, and we want to see it work and see it commercialized. We're not good at that, relatively speaking. I mean, universities need to have a commercial partner to actually put the technology into motion. And so that's simply something that we would prefer to have a commercial partner do anyway.
As you were walking through how the deal came together, you mentioned a couple things that I thought were really great, just sort of nuts and bolts lessons learned, or advice for somebody trying to put together a public-private partnership like this. Just for example, you mentioned the issues you guys were having with coming together with agreements on the timing of releases of information. I thought that was a great point there, and then how you broke down the deal really into phases, which allowed industry to have some flexibility, but some stability for the institution, balancing those issues. So I'm kind of curious, what's your advice for lawyers that are working through negotiating these kinds of things, where maybe they encounter an issue like this for the first time? What's your advice for them on where do they go to maybe get guidance on how to do these things, or how did you work through first time challenges when it was something maybe you hadn't encountered before?
That's a good question. I'm trying to think of a specific example. Previously, I'd done university construction for about a decade in the general counsel's office, and so we had a lot of things come up that if I hadn't had that background, we would have big questions, or at least known unknowns about what needed to happen there. And so I think within, kind of a design construction point of view, or whether it's the IP point of view, trying to narrow and break out each of these areas in the negotiation too, saying, hey, this is an entire deal together, but let's focus on each of these areas one at a time, and then going to In the IP sense, I do a lot of IP, but not lasers, or really working with the subject matter experts. I'm trying to think of something more specific as an answer. I think that it sounds simple, but that network of professional contacts, whether that's within the government or in a field like this high energy laser field, it's not that big, relatively speaking. And going to conferences and making connections and talking to people that then you can call and say informally, we're working on this aspect. What do you suggest? Was maybe one of the most valuable things. So I think even if you're not in the area of the science itself, working with your researchers so you can reach out and eventually talk to the general counsel of the company we're working with, or have other contacts like that where you can bounce things off. I found that network to actually maybe be the most useful thing.
Thanks. Yeah. And another question here is, you're going through, this negotiation, of course, involved a German company, right? So another country, a slightly different culture. And here at the Academy, we have in the law department here, we teach negotiations. We also have a whole clinic on negotiations, and obviously these are important things, but the attorneys do it. And we talk a lot about especially as military members, we are often engaging with different cultures. Have you found any challenges with negotiating with different cultures, and how did you work through those challenges to get a deal put together?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, certainly there are just inherent differences. I mean, the system of law, how they handle intellectual property is very different. And kind of understanding the leverage of the situation in terms of who needs who and how this needs to work, and understanding that this is going to be in the U.S. We need this kind of law or structure and those kind of things to be involved. That would be natural in any negotiation, but Marvel helped get counsel locally to understand how the federal funding process works, how to do these other things, and we said we will help you with that. I mean, we will help you understand why should a foreign startup company know how to apply and get funded through DoD or DARPA or any U.S. agency. That's something we can help them with, and kind of the more trust you build in that context, the easier it was to convince, and probably the reverse for them, convince them that this is the way we need to do this. I will be from the technical side, the engineering approaches are very different. I think in maybe not a stereotypical way, but I think our engineers were less focused and SOP driven and kind of more creative and kind of trying to put things together that way. And the German engineers we worked with were very methodical and very structured in the way they looked at it. So we had to get not even just the legal teams, but get our technical teams on the same page, all in the context of this has to get done by the middle of 2026. So that helped a lot. Motivation ultimately of the timeline, that being deadline oriented, working backwards into getting people to at least move on together, even if we haven't figured out every detail. So you're kind of getting to the next stage while you're finishing the previous stage, and trusting each other to mop up those differences.
Have you ever felt like you were sort of at an impasse on a negotiation, and it just didn't seem like you were going to be able to break through? And then what happened where you did get through it?
Sure. Just like in any contract where you're drafting with some, purposeful ambiguity in areas where you either don't know what you need yet, or you don't want to be, stuck to something very particular that maybe you don't want anymore, where you just don't know yet. There are several aspects to the deal because of the exploratory nature of the science that the partner's doing, uncertainty, and even within the university, and then just technical things that are still being developed. We built in several will agree to agrees on certain things that we knew we had a year to figure out together in good faith. And maybe those are just wide open. Maybe it's someone's going to do part of this and you're going to do part of this. But knowing that we had to solve those, and the federal sequester comes to mind, even though that's not the way it turned out, was that if we don't figure this stuff out together, the project won't move forward. So again, it becomes deadline oriented, but sort of agreeing on the areas that we either don't have consensus on yet, but we know we're going to have to, but we need to keep moving. So we definitely had some of those, and now we're in the stage where those are being sorted out, and waiting also gave us, we learned a lot more in that time, so they became easier to solve over time as well, and that was part of the reason to wait. But there are very different needs, both on that technical engineering side that I mentioned, and also, I mean, their goals are a little different than our goals, and so you have to kind of come back in that Venn diagram to work backwards into what's the minimum that we can both do, and then keep going from there.
Thanks. I was also curious, as you were talking about developing the physical building and the plans for it, the infrastructure, with a forward-looking view toward future security needs, and ITAR compliance and all these aspects. As you're working through then the negotiations for how those plans are going to look, who do you bring in to provide that kind of expertise on what are we going to need? Like, you mentioned, maybe we need a skiff in the future. Where does that kind of expertise come from?
I mean, there's some inherent institutional expertise in there, but it's certainly narrow compared to, an outside firm that does that, or, a sector of the federal government that does that. So we definitely drew on contractors that we've worked with before that have expertise there, even if it's simply to agree with our work and approach. I mean, there's value in that too. And then by picking a design firm and a general contractor that have done this kind of work before. Our design firm is the architectural firm that designed the laser facility, the LLE facility at University of Rochester. And so they literally have done a lot of this work. And so they had a lot of both institutional knowledge just in their firm, and then also knew the right people to talk to kind of at least all be on the same side of the fence about making a security decision like that.
All right. Well, thanks so much. I think that kind of wraps up our questions we have here. Was there anything else you'd like to, give us before we sign off?
Just thank you for having me here. I should have mentioned right at the beginning that we're, as a public entity and open records and a lot of things have been out there, I'm talking about a lot of things that are available and not sharing information that's behind confidentiality, although there is a lot of that we didn't talk about. So, but acknowledging that and just appreciate the opportunity. And if people have follow-up questions or want to talk about them, I'm happy to provide that.
Great, thank you. Well, in closing then, as this was our third of three webinars in this series on nuclear fusion and the legal and regulatory aspects of it, I want to sign off with a thanks to our three presenters, John Meyer, Sachin Desai, and you, Mr. Grant Calhoun, for all of your generosity with your time and sharing your thoughts in this field with us. And I also want to give a special thanks to Dave Vasco from the Five Lakes Institute, who has really set us off on this whole endeavor and sort of made some of the initial introductions. For everyone, as always, if you have ideas for future webinars, feel free to reach out to me. I'd be happy to talk with you and see what we can put together. So thank you to everyone for joining, and I wish everyone have a wonderful day.
Thank you.